Our next guest, we found him. We had to do a little bit of detective work, but we found a very interesting idea written up, among other places, in New Scientist. It was discussed at a recent conference called Theorizing the Web. And the idea, basically, I don't want to oversimplify it. He'll explain it, but we found that the idea was originally generated by our next guest, Nick Seaver. He is a PhD student at the moment in UC Irvine's Department of Anthropology. He's co-chair of the American Anthropological Association's Committee on the Anthropology of Science, Technology, and Computing. So he's got a lot of interests that parallel our own, and he's on his way to joining the Department of Anthropology at Tufts University when he completes his studies. Nick, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us, now you had an idea, which is you look back in history and you found that there was a time when non-human entities, for lack of a better term, could be sued. And you suggested that maybe it might be time to bring that idea back. Tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
Sure. So this came up in the context of a bunch of social scientists researching algorithms. And so these are, things like personalization algorithms online, but also more serious algorithms like the kind that, decide things about policing or what kinds of loans you can get. And a question that comes up very often for social scientists interested in this stuff is, what happens when these systems do something wrong? How do we hold someone accountable? So we have a series of conferences and papers and workshops all called Variations on the Theme Algorithms and Accountability. And my question, sort of as an anthropologist, I'm interested in the very wide historical and geographic variation in ideas. And so my question was, maybe this problem is less to do with algorithms and more to do with our idea about what accountability is. And so if you sort of look to the history of accountability, there's this concept that comes out of sort of medieval British common law that's called the Deodand. And the Deodand is an object that gets held culpable for someone's death. So you can imagine, if a goat kicks someone and they die, or if a flower pot falls off of a windowsill and lands on someone's head and they die, those objects are considered guilty of killing the person. So this is just sort of for me, it was originally an idea to say, hey, look, accountability used to be weirder than people might assume it is now. So people today would say, well, no, you need to find a person to hold accountable. This is a good example from the sort of history that's, there are in state constitutions in the U.S., there are actually rules against Deodands. So this is still sort of in the living memory of our legal systems in the U.S., for sure.
See, here's one of the things I found interesting about the whole idea of the Deodand and the idea of finding non-human things criminally culpable, or however you want to put it, guilty, assigning responsibility to them. And it is this, that right now we're at a moment in history where we have a concept called corporate personhood, which suggests that corporations, non-human things, have rights, but essentially no accountability, or very relatively little. They have some, but here's a concept that basically says all manner of non-human things can have accountability. And what happens? Let's say that an ox cart goes out of control and kills 3 people in the medieval British square. What would happen to it and to its owner?
Sure. So the interesting thing about the Deodand is not just the object is held accountable, but, okay, sure, the ox cart is guilty of killing someone. Now what do we do? It turns out that sort of from a very early stage in the common law practice of Deodands, and we're talking about like the 1100s or something like that, what would end up happening is that people would ascribe a monetary value to the object that was guilty. So say I owned the ox cart, we decide how much the ox cart is worth. And I would end up paying that money as a fine. And so while instead, in the original sense of this was that I would actually give up the ox cart itself, Deodand, etymologically meaning given to God, and in effect in Britain this meant given to the king, who was God's representative. Instead, what would happen is I would actually say, okay, the cart is worth this much money. Here you go. Here's the money instead. And so it was already sort of being swapped out for a kind of financial responsibility, even in the Middle Ages.
Who would get the money? The victim or the victim's family?
Yeah, so the victim's family. This is again a thing that's common law, so it ends up sort of being variable and local. But yeah, so the victim's family would be one of the kinds of entities that would receive this kind of payment. But so the interesting thing becomes sort of over time as common law accumulates, it sort of goes out of favor by the 19th century or so. People stop doing this Deodands stuff, except that in the late 19th century, you have a big rash of events where non-human objects are killing people. And what this is the railroads. So the railroads get implemented and people are getting sort of hit by trains left and right. And there are a variety of entities trying to use the Deodand law at this time to hold those railway companies accountable, right? So if in 1200 I had been killed by an ox cart, the owner of the ox cart would be financially responsible to my family. Now, in the late 19th century, if I get killed by a train, maybe the train can be held responsible. So there were a few judgments that were not well received by the railway authorities, because you can imagine if an ox cart's not very expensive, you pay the value of the thing that did the killing of the Deodand. A train is very expensive, and you have these questions about, is it the cost of the train? Is it the cost of the train plus all of the stuff in the train? And so pretty quickly, when it becomes clear that this is going to be used, to stop the railroads from expanding as quickly as they wanted to, the relevant laws get passed in the UK, and the Deodands go away. And so they say, you can't use that.
So we're talking with anthropologist Nick Seaver about the concept of suing objects, the Deodand concept. Now, what we have now, it's got all sorts of permutations, this idea, but what we have now, at least in theory, is a system that says, let's take the railroads. If the railroad was irresponsible, in other words, if it didn't take proper precautions and someone is killed, they can sue. We don't have this idea of holding the train accountable, but someone can sue based not on the worth of the train or the value of the train, but on the imputed value of the life that was lost, for example, or the limb that was lost or whatever. And how is the Deodand concept better or worse, in your opinion, than that?
Sure. So first, I guess I should say that, I'm not a legal scholar. I'm an anthropologist. And so what's interesting to me is not so much, which of these laws is the best for whoever, but what they reflect about how people think about culpability and how that changes over time. So the interesting thing about the Deodand law is that you circuit through this idea that some sort of non-human thing is in effect guilty. So it's not quite the same thing as negligence, right? Because you don't need to prove that the person who is responsible for the train or the conductor or whoever it did something wrong. You just need to show that someone was killed, and the Deodand was specifically for human death, which goes to show how sort of it's reserved for serious things. But the point that's interesting about this is, Kate Crawford pointed this out in her talk at Theorizing the Web not so long ago, that basically capitalism killed the Deodand, right? The expansion of the railroads was this sort of capitalist force, and the Deodand stood in the way of that, and capitalism was stronger than the Deodand and took it down. So it's interesting to see now, you brought up corporate personhood, all of these ideas about culpability, about what kind of thing a person is, about what persons can be expected to do and to be held accountable for. All of these are tied up in, what I would call anthropological cultural ideas about the way the world works. They're not necessarily legal or right. They're just sort of how we do things. So we can imagine.
Right. And I guess what I would say to that, and what interests me about that, we're talking with anthropologist Nick Seaver, is the whole concept of agency gets involved. In other words, the ability of a person and or a thing to be acting more or less in a way on its own behalf. And that is an anthropological, to me, cultural question, what we think has agency and what doesn't. What has struck me, I've written a fair amount about technology and the economics of digital tech and so on. And what strikes me a lot, and I'm not an anthropologist, but what strikes me a lot when I look at this issue and write about it, think about it, is the extent to which people transfer perhaps not too little, but even too much agency to, for example, to computer programs. I was a programmer early in my life. I designed business systems and so on. And it strikes me that people think they're more autonomous than they are. They'll call a machine a robot. They'll call a program an artificial mind. And so somehow, well, if someone is hurt, even if it's, or killed, let's say, even if it's the entirely predictable result of the way a machine was programmed or designed, or a software system was programmed or designed, it's almost as if, well, no, this non-human being did it and we can't blame anybody. And so the Deodand idea struck me. It had a different, interesting take on all of that. How do you feel the concept of sort of agency fits into all of this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a huge can of worms, right? So for philosophers of technology, agency is a big question. The distribution of agency across people and not people, and to some people, it sounds like a horrible, crazy idea to decide that objects can, have agency. And often that has to do specifically with the idea that humans will hide behind that, right? You'll say, oh, it wasn't me, it was the train. And, this is kind of not a real argument against a lot of this stuff because, for example, with the Deodand, with the Deodand law, people can't hide behind it. You don't say, oh, I didn't kill that person, my flower pot did. You are still responsible as the owner of the
Right.
of the flower pot for what your, flower pot dependent, I guess, has done. So yeah, these are still, I think, open questions. I think that they don't necessarily have one right answer. And if we've learned anything from the sort of history of anthropology, it's that what agency is, what kinds of things have agency, how we should understand what that means, is super variable, right? So you have people who attribute agency to animals differently. You have people who attribute agency to the environment in general. There are all sorts of things. And I would be hesitant to call one of those more correct or not, because this isn't a question about, getting to the root of knowledge about the world. It's a question about how to live our lives. And so why not live our life in another way if we want to? So that's kind of what's exciting about this algorithm situation now, is that the norms are not settled. We don't know what it's going to be like. And to my mind, what we ought to do is look as widely as we can for ways that people have historically and geographically dealt with this.
And I think that's the key point that I took away from this, is that it gives us another tool for looking at and potentially addressing these issues, that you get into the diffusion of responsibility that happens when 16 people contribute to the software that's operating a system, and 16 others and corporations and so on get involved with the hardware. But in this case, it boils down, it is a simple and elegant way of looking at it that basically says, well, if harm, in this case death, resulted from it, it doesn't really, it simplifies some of those issues. It just basically says, well, the thing is to an extent responsible, and the remedy is the value of the thing. And it gives us another way of looking at it. And I guess if you agree with that, and I don't know if you do, my last question would be, are you writing about this now?
Yeah, so I would say that I do. I sort of agree with it. I agree with it as a way to open our minds, or, anthropologists like to say things like, we want to make the familiar strange. So this is an interesting way of thinking about agency that reveals to us how weird agency is, right? And so that's
Right.
sort of one of the goals. But again, speaking as an anthropologist, I study the engineers who make this kind of stuff, and they're people. They feel responsible for the stuff that they make, and especially in the case of, online, like the Facebook newsfeed algorithm or something like that, they're constantly tweaking it, right? So you can't meaningfully talk about the Facebook algorithm, say, as an autonomous thing at any moment, because there's always someone futzing with something. And yes, I am working on it. I'm writing up a bit about this with Kate Crawford, who's at Microsoft Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so hopefully that should come out, on academic timescale. So don't look forward to it anytime soon. But we're working on it. So there's some interesting stuff in the pipe.
Well, I hope when it comes out, you'll come back and talk to us, because I think it's a fascinating idea and one worth exploring. And I've enjoyed the conversation. So thanks so much, Nick Seaver, anthropologist, for coming on the program.
Thanks so much.
And we will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.